Okay, so today we're going to talk about the roots of Nazism. This is not the growth of the Nazi Party, nor Hitler taking over the Nazi Party as he does in early 1920s. This is literally where does the philosophy of Nazism come from? Like how what do they believe? Why do they believe it? Why would people buy into it? So it's looking at the core tenets of Nazism as a ideology, as a belief structure. And then we'll talk more about, as a political party, how and why it grew and how Hitler took over and became opportunistic as time goes on. So, really, the thing I want to emphasize here is this is just conceptual. This is kind of in the abstract, which is tough to wrap your head around, but at the same time, it's important to know because I do think it's important to understand how or what Nazism really is when you get down to it. Because it's one of those things, as with everything in history, the more you know about it, the better informed you are, against it, or the more informed you can make your decisions in the future. And as always, we try and go against Nazis here in Mr. Wiggins history class. So I've beaten this over you, beaten you over the head with this many times. But the concept here is that communism is a radical result of World War One. Radical World War One is such a catastrophic event that it creates communism. That without World War One, you don't have communism in the Soviet Union. Because again, prior to that, it was just a concept, just kind of floating around. Now, because of communism, you have fascism. If communism is that giant boogeyman for the Europeans in Italy and Germany and Spain, hell, even in France, and the terrifying thing is that communism is coming for you. And where that had always kind of been a boogeyman, no one, you didn't take it too seriously because communism never really worked. Well, here's communism in the Soviet Union, the largest country in Europe, which, it's historically had a powerful military. So the concern here is that you're looking at this and saying this is a legitimate threat. And that's going to fuel people's, flocking to fascism. Because remember, communism, people are all powerful, government controls the entire economy. That's the idea. Whereas in fascism, the state is powerful, militaristic, and individuals' value is relative to the state, meaning your value in their society rests chiefly upon what you contribute to the state, how the state benefits. And again, in communism, when we say people are all powerful, that's in theory. In reality, we tend to see, like in the Soviet Union, the government has all the power. Guys like Joseph Stalin rule with an iron fist. So they do kind of have that in common with fascism. But isn't that the way it always is? Don't we often hate the things most that we kind of see in ourselves? So, what do we need to know about the Nazi Party? A couple of things. It's actually the National Socialist German Workers' Party. National Socialist German Workers' Party. And in German, that's the NSDAP. The problem is NSDAP is kind of a mouthful. NASDAP doesn't really roll off the tongue, nor does the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So it's shortened to National Socialists. And if you take National Socialist in German, NA for nationalism, socialism, ZI, you smash them together and there you go, Nazi. Nazi is just an abomination of two terms, stuck together, like J-Lo, like Brangelina, like, well, you get the idea. The point is, it's just those two words smashed together. So they're National Socialists. And again, don't get caught up in the idea of like, oh, well, it's socialism, and well, isn't that what the Soviet Union is? It's one of those things that a lot of people will claim to be socialists because, in theory, it can be beneficial it appeals to the working class. So, like, you'll find terrorist groups around the world, and no one calls themselves like, oh, the bastard terrorist group that kills innocent people. They all call themselves like freedom fighters, restoring holy promise to the Holy Land. It's all painted in a positive light. So don't get too caught up on terminology here. The focus really is on nationalist first. Now, Hitler's going to join the party shortly after its inception, and it's going to gain some traction because of the disarray that Germany's in after World War One. Because don't forget, they have a brand new government that's democratic, which they've never had before. You have military veterans returning home who are a little bothered that they lost the war and they don't quite get how. The civilian population is exhausted from wartime. You have communist uprisings, like the Spartacist uprising. You have multiple people kind of trying to undermine the Weimar government actively, even those partaking in it directly. And Hitler will become one of those in the near future. And then you also have right wing groups going around. You have paramilitary organizations. These and oh yeah, by the way, the economy is totally destroyed with hyperinflation. So you have political turmoil, you have economic instability, to put it mildly, you have society kind of ripping itself apart, and you have violence in the streets. Quite literally, the Freikorps are fighting and beating up and killing communists in the streets. And don't get me wrong, communists are doing it back to the Freikorps as well. It's just, you know, the Freikorps are former World War One veterans who are a little bit more proficient at the beating up and the killing and the intimidation aspect, so they tend to be more successful. So when we talk about the Nazis, the worst thing you can do is think like, oh, well, the Nazis are, they are the extremist group. No, no, no. They are not the extremist group. They're one. All right. There were dozens of extremist groups in Germany that all harkened on different aspects. And again, they were on the left and on the right. So you have to take the Nazis in this point and kind of view them in the context of what's going on. They are not the only extremist group, but they are one that kind of tap into something. So we're going to take a look at these 6 core aspects of Nazism. The first one that I want to talk about is this concept of Völkisch nationalism. Now, Völkisch nationalism is point blank the most simplest way to explain it. The belief that there's a collective soul of all the German people, that all Germans are connected, that there's something intangible, there's something spiritual about your nationality. That here in Germany, you've had people who have been living in that region, in some cases for over 1,000 years, and there's something sacred with those people. These are people that you've lived in the same region with for centuries, 1,000 years. And so there's something more than just what can be understood by, touch, taste, hear, see, that kind of stuff. This spiritual principle, and that all Germans, no matter where you are connected by something greater, something, again, something spiritual. And this kind of, dips into the occult the Nazis were famous for pursuing. But there, again, this kind of idea, this principle, it does have a lot of, subscribers. People kind of believe it. Like, yeah, there is something about all the Germans. There is something about your nationality. When you bump into somebody who's from the same place you are, out in the world, you feel connected. You feel a kinship. You feel a bond. And that's what we mean by Völkisch nationalism, literally the people's nationalism. The Nazis also were huge fans of Nietzsche, and especially the concept of will to power. Now, prior to this, remember the kind of Christian ethic, which was, you turn the other cheek. Well, turning the other cheek literally means, if someone hits you on one side, you offer them the other. So it's the weaker side of things, as Nietzsche would argue. So you look at Christianity, and it embodies the weaknesses of humanity, is how Nietzsche would view it. The argument that, you look at some of the gods of like Central America, like flying serpent lizards, and some of the old school like Greek gods throwing thunderbolts and stuff, and these are impressive. Like, what did Jesus do? No, he died on a cross. It's not really that impressive. It doesn't really. It's not awe-inspiring. So Nietzsche's point was that why are we subjecting ourselves to these weak moralities? Like, why are we donating to charity? Why are we offering to turn the cheek? Why aren't we emboldening ourselves, especially in Germany, this kind of warrior ethos? Let's go back to these, like the Germans being this intense, crazy group of people that were unable to be conquered by the Romans. Go back to that warrior mentality, courage, competition, honor, loyalty, strength. These are things that we want to exemplify. And in Nietzsche's argument is that, Christianity really undermines that. Christianity really waters that down and says, no, 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 no. Don't compete, share. Honor and loyalty, yes, but to, God and institutions of the church, not necessarily to, the people that are around you, your kin. Strength doesn't matter. It's more about like, your strength of your spirit, your soul, the purity of heart kind of stuff, as opposed to, physically being able to dominate somebody or military prowess or stuff like that. So really, the Nazis were saying, listen, as Nietzsche pointed out, the belief in God has been shaken for many people living in Europe. And so, as the Nazis are going to kind of use over and over again, if they can exploit a group and benefit off of that exploitation, then they should do it. And as an individual, you should do it. So we see this time and time again, whether it be the Nazis exploiting other political groups and or crises that rise to promote themselves. We see it in terms of exploiting minority groups that are in Germany, most notably the Jewish population, and benefiting from ostracizing that group from society and discriminating against them, persecuting them, and eventually exterminating them from German society. And then we see it on the national scale, where they start taking advantage of the countries around them that are weaker. Czechoslovakia springs to mind. And so that's what we're talking about here. The Germans are going to seize power, and they don't really care about anybody else. We're going to do right by us, and it's kind of this, again, return to those ancient warrior values is the argument. Now, there's also this concept of blood and soil nationalism. And again, this is kind of like Volkish nationalism in a sense that it creates a strong belonging of there's an us and a them. So when we talk about Volkish nationalism, we talked about like that intangible spirit. Blood and soil nationalism is a little bit more tangible. It's that belief that you as a German, you have claim to German land. Your ancestors tilled the land, fought for the land, died in the land, they're buried in the land. And that's the case for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And so you have a right to that land, certainly over anyone else who came here from someplace else. So the argument here is that, if your ancestors came to the United States on the Mayflower and you've been here for 400 plus years at this point, like you're here. Is it really 4? Yeah, about 400 years. Yeah, all right. So 400 years. So you've been here for 400 years. And then somebody, some Canadian buys the land, like swoops in and buys territory from you. And the Germans would hearken on it and say, like, there's something innately unfair about that. That this is a place where your, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-great-grand, and so forth and so on, all the way back to the Mayflower, you've lived on this land. This is your land. And some foreigner's going to come in and scoop it up? Well, that seems ridiculous. That seems patently unfair. Unjust. And so blood and soil nationalism emphasizes the idea that you have a right to the soil and that we shouldn't be allowing any non-Germans to be living in Germany. They shouldn't be taking up the space. Like, yeah, they can come and visit and stay in the hotels and take pictures of the touristy stuff, and that's fine, but they shouldn't own a home in Germany unless every other German has a home in Germany already. And again, this doesn't sound outrageous. It kind of makes sense in a certain way. Think of it this way. If you were going to be a politician in the United States today and you advocated, homes for American citizens first, and then anyone who comes who's a, foreign-born citizen, or I'm sorry, not a citizen, put it that way, someone who's from overseas, who has come here, who is not a citizen, who's not planning on living, staying in America. In other words, if someone buys a vacation mansion here but spends most of their time someplace else, and you advocate, no, we're not allowing that. We're going to give that to the impoverished Americans that live here. I don't think you'd have a lot of pushback from American citizens. And so again, that's the scary thing about Nazism, is that when you break it down to its core components, a lot of it on the surface sounds like, oh, I could buy into part of that. Like, I can see it. And that's the insidious part of Nazism, is where we're trying to go here. Social Darwinism we've talked a lot about before. We talked about it with imperialism, right? The idea that you're competing, and if you win, well, then you're better, you're more evolved, you're stronger, you're all that stuff. And so again, fascism is going to look at this thing and say you have to compete to survive. That you can't settle your differences peaceably, talking things out. Again, those warrior values, you fight it, and that makes you stronger. That makes you better. Iron sharpens iron is the way you got to view it. So that mindset permeates everything they do, whether it be on the national scale when it comes to negotiations, or hell, when it comes to the smaller scale, like even in schools or in society in general. Like, it's encouraging violence. And on the one hand, we could say, well, that's awful and that's terrible. We should encourage violence, which by and large most societies agree with, that you don't want rampant violence running through the streets. But in the context of Germany, these are people, or especially kids, who have grown up seeing violence. I mean, if you were born at the end of World War I, you grew up in the 1920s seeing recurring violence in the streets between right-wing militias of the Freikorps and communist groups. You're used to it. So again, it's not that hard to swallow. And social Darwinism as a concept had been, thrown around in European circles for, a century at this point. So, well, I shouldn't say the term, not over a century, but for several decades at the very least, the term has been floating around, and people largely buy into it. Before we skip it, racism is pretty clear. Again, racism is one of these things where people try and look at the differences between humans and recognize, like, say, this is why that group is less successful than others. And that makes sense to a certain degree. We always try and find the reasoning for why things happen. We often look for the connections, look for the patterns, we look for understanding. So that makes sense. And the Europeans really seize upon racism to understand why they were better off than, the Africans when they took them and enslaved them and brought them to the New World, or when they colonized Africa or South Asia or East Asia or Southeast Asia and so forth and so on. But racism, the sad part is races don't exist. We are one human race, and that's it. There's as much ethnic diversity between someone from Italy and South Korea as there are within South Korea, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. So the differences literally are skin deep. But the Germans are going to be able to seize upon it. The difference here, though, and this is why I was hesitant to even call it racism, though, is that while, yes, the incredibly racist the Nazis are, they define race in just odd ways. For example, they define racism as someone who is Jewish. Well, Judaism is a religion, and if you're Jewish, that's the religion of choice. And while there is some truth to the idea that certain communities want to marry, and so sometimes you can trace like a genetic lineage back because this group marries this group and they kind of stay within that circle, whether it be the Kurds or the Jews or whoever. There's not a difference there between anybody else. And so the Germans, basically what they're doing is they're saying, well, if you're Jewish, you're a different ethnic group, which is absurd when you think about it. I mean, think about it. If we said, well, Catholics and Protestants, those are two different ethnic groups. That makes zero sense. Makes no sense whatsoever. But that's what the Nazis adhere to. And what they were able to do is to tap in this deep-seated anti-Semitism, because Europe had existed with that for a long time. There's centuries of examples of the Europeans, acting out against the Jewish populations, in large part because they were an easy-to-go-to scapegoat. They were an easy ones to point at the cause for all these things going bad, and that's what happens. And we've seen that throughout the Middle Ages, the early modern era, and certainly into the modern era. Now, eugenics is the belief that you want to ensure good genes. And you ensure good genes by eliminating those with bad genes. You prevent those with bad genes from reproducing. And again, for a lot of Europeans at this time, well, that would seem to make sense. If there's someone with a birth defect, you wouldn't want that person passing their genes on and having another kid with a birth defect and so forth and so on. But the decision is made for these people, and the Germans, again, the Nazis are determining what would constitute good genes. So while there are some examples of genetic issues that can be passed from one generation to another, a lot of these can be largely benign, and some of them aren't. But at the end of the day, the Nazis are the ones who believe they should be making the call. And so they make the call when it's, in some cases, if someone is physically or mentally handicapped from birth, well, those are bad genes. They should be eliminated. And again, early on, it's a matter of, sterilization, things along those lines. And then you get all the way up to actual elimination. And we see this again with Judaism. The anti-Semitism against the Jewish people in Germany, where they're eliminated. So it's this concept that, you got to breed good genes with good genes and get better kids. And the Nazis believed wholeheartedly in this. I mean, they actually would encourage German officers to, they'd have these, call it like mixers, get-togethers, whatever you want to call it, with eligible young women to encourage young German officers to marry and have kids at a young age with young German women. And they would want you to have as many kids as possible. In Italy, for example, if you had like 14 kids, you got a medal and you got to meet Benito Mussolini. Well, the same thing was in place in Germany. Only they tended to be a little bit more specific about the lineage. So you had to prove your lineage back, 10 or 12 generations. So here's the big deal. Here's the major point, and this is the end of it. The Nazis took existing European ideals and implemented them in radical ways. So the Nazis didn't invent anything. They didn't come up with the concept of will to power or Volkish nationalism, blood and soil nationalism. They didn't come up with racism or eugenics or social Darwinism. All that existed prior to the Nazis. That was all around there. That was floating around there, and that had varying degrees of buy-in from the European populations, not just in Germany, but around Europe as a continent as a whole. What they do, though, is they tie them together and they make an ideology out of these existing ideas. And then they carry out those ideologies to the extreme. So when we talk about eugenics, again, people today can be like, oh, well, I can understand the science of the argument behind it, let's say. They're like, oh, yeah, sure. Like if someone is going to pass on a genetic um, issue, then that's something that maybe the person should strongly consider not having kids or whatever it might be. But we logically today view that as a personal decision, not the government's decision. But back in the day, people were willing to take that extra step, especially when they saw some benefit to them. Social Darwinism seemed to make a lot of sense, and again, reinforced or made them feel better, at least after World War One. It was a complete catastrophe. So it made sense that you could say, well, the Jews betrayed us, or we were betrayed by the politicians, and that's why we lost. So we really were going to win the war, which kind of, jives with social Darwinism. So the point here is that, again, the Nazis take what exists, but they force it to the extreme. They bring it all the way to its kind of logical extremist end, which is going to be the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews and 5 million other social undesirables. Because don't forget, the Holocaust, we focus on the Jewish population because they certainly got the brunt in terms of numbers and in terms of persecution. But there's other groups too that were persecuted as well: Gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, the physically, mentally handicapped, homosexuals, so forth and so on. So, the Nazis certainly were preoccupied with the Jewish people, but they were equal opportunity offenders when it comes to killing. So, I hope what you've gotten from today and from this is that you understand that the Nazis' philosophy, what they believed in, comes from these different strands of European thought that already existed, that are morphed together, kind of brought together, baked in an oven, if you will, and ends up with this Nazi ideology that justifies what they do. They're justified in exterminating people as will to power. They're justified in persecuting people they consider quote unquote non-German with blood and soil nationalism and folkish nationalism. They're justified in conquering other nations, social Darwinism. Like this is the points that they go back to and they use to justify their actions. And again, nothing new. This is what existed in Europe at the time. They just kind of brought it all together and made an ideology out of it. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. If not, always feel free to email and reach out. Otherwise, I will see you folks in class again soon.